Brazil's Carnival is often described as the greatest popular festival on earth, a celebration of color, movement, rhythm, and joy that captures the attention of millions around the world every year. From the outside, it looks like a spectacle, a grand parade of costumes, samba dancers, drums, and lights, an explosion of creativity and celebration that seems at first glance to exist purely for entertainment. But Carnival did not emerge from emptiness, and it did not grow only from music and dance. Beneath the spectacle lies something far older, deeper, and more complex. To truly understand Carnival, we must look beyond the avenue, beyond the sambadrome, and beyond the cameras. We must return to the cultural and spiritual roots that shaped the very soul of this celebration. Because Carnival, as it exists in Brazil today, carries the imprint of Afro-Brazilian history, spirituality, and resistance. For researchers of Brazilian culture, Carnival is not simply a party, it is a living archive, a space where memory survives through rhythm, where identity moves through the body, where traditions once confined to silence step into public visibility. According to Carnival researcher, intellectual and cultural commentator Milton Cunha, the samba schools did not arise separately from Afro-Brazilian spiritual tradition. They emerged from the same historical soil. In his analysis, the schools of samba are deeply connected to Candomblé and Umbanda, religions that were born from the African diaspora and shaped by centuries of struggle, adaptation, and survival. To understand this connection, we must first confront a common misunderstanding. Many people, both inside and outside Brazil, assume that Afro-Brazilian religions exist only inside temples, terreiros, or private rituals. They imagine spirituality as something hidden, secret, or marginal. But Afro-Brazilian spirituality was never meant to be invisible. In these traditions, spirituality moves through sound, through the body, through collective presence. It is experienced through rhythm, dance, song, and shared energy. And this is where Carnival enters the story. Long before Carnival became a global spectacle, Black and indigenous communities in Brazil used rhythm and gathering as forms of survival. Drums were not entertainment. They were language. They carried prayers, memories, and ancestral knowledge. They organized community. They preserved identity in a society that attempted to erase it. When samba schools began to take form in Brazil's urban centers, especially in Rio de Janeiro, they did not invent this rhythm. They inherited. The percussion that defines samba today is directly linked to the batuque, the sacred drumming traditions practiced in Afro-Brazilian religious spaces. The musicians known as ogás, responsible for guiding rhythm and percussion in the terreiros, were among those who carried this musical knowledge into the emerging samba schools. In other words, the drum did not move from the street to the temple, it moved from the temple to the street. This transition was not accidental, it was historical. As Afro-Brazilian religions faced persecution, repression, and criminalization, their cultural expressions found new ways to survive. Music and dance became vehicles of continuity. Carnival became one of those vehicles. According to Milton Cunha, the samba school is a descendant of the drum, and the drum comes from the terreiros. The rhythms heard in the avenue echo the same spiritual foundations that guide Afro-Brazilian religious practice. This does not mean that Carnival is a religious ritual in the traditional sense, but it does mean that its structure, energy, and symbolism cannot be separated from spiritual ancestry. Every beat of the drum carries memory, every movement carries history, and this is why Carnival cannot be fully understood as entertainment alone. It is culture in motion. It is history made visible. It is spirituality expressed through collective creation. To investigate Umbanda is to investigate these intersections between faith and culture, between ritual and public life, between what was once hidden and what now stands in the open. And to investigate Carnival is to recognize that beneath the celebration lies a deeper inheritance, shaped by Afro-Brazilian spirituality, ancestral presence, and the enduring power of the drum. Before the parade officially begins, there is a moment that most television broadcasts barely explain. It happens behind the gates, out of frame, away from the spotlight. Sambistas gather, drummers test their instruments, dancers breathe deeply, stretch their bodies, and focus their minds. This moment is called esquenta. In literal terms, esquenta means warm-up, but that translation barely scratches the surface of what is actually happening. For those inside the samba schools, the esquenta is not simply physical preparation, it is a moment of alignment. Body, rhythm, emotion, and intention begin to synchronize. Nervousness turns into focus. Individual anxiety dissolves into collective purpose. According to Milton Cunha, this concentration of energy carries a meaning that goes far beyond performance. In Afro-Brazilian spiritual traditions, preparation is never empty, it is never neutral. To prepare is to open space, to align, to invite presence. In Candomblé and Umbanda, rituals often begin with moments of concentration, rhythm, and focused intention. The body becomes receptive, the community becomes unified. The esquenta follows a similar logic. As the drums begin to sound, they do more than establish tempo, they activate memory. Rhythm, in Afro-Brazilian culture, is not background noise, it is a form of communication. Each beat carries information, each sequence of sound organizes movement, emotion, and attention. This is why the esquenta feels intense, even before the parade starts. What builds in that moment is not only excitement, it is energy. Milton Cunha describes this moment as a form of invocation. When the flag bearer spins, he explains, the wind moves. And with that movement, something older is called. According to his interpretation, that spinning gesture symbolically reaches toward the ancestors, especially those who founded the Quilombos, the communities formed by formerly enslaved people who resisted oppression and preserved African tradition. In this view, the esquenta is not about summoning spirits in a literal sense, it is about reconnecting with lineage. In Afro-Brazilian cosmology, ancestors are not abstract figures from the past. They are active references, sources of strength, memory, and guidance. Movement, wind, rhythm, and repetition are all ways of acknowledging their presence. The body becomes a bridge between generations. When the drums sound together, individual stories merge into something collective. The school stops being a group of performers and becomes a single organism. This collective state is essential. In Umbanda and Candomblé, spiritual force is not generated in isolation, it emerges through community rhythm and shared focus. The esquenta reflects this same principle. It transforms many individuals into one body moving toward a common purpose. This helps explain why Carnival feels different from other large-scale performances. The energy is not manufactured, it is accumulated. It builds slowly, carried by repetition, memory, and shared intention. The drummers, many of whom inherited their musical knowledge through family and community traditions, play rhythms that echo the sacred drums of the toreros. The difference is not in the source but in the setting. What was once confined to protected spaces now flows through the street. This does not strip the rhythm of its meaning, it amplifies it. The esquenta becomes a threshold, a moment between preparation and revelation, between private memory and public expression, and when the gates finally open and the parade begins, the energy that emerges has already been shaped. What the audience witnesses on the avenue is not spontaneous chaos. It is the result of alignment, cultural, emotional, and ancestral. Understanding the esquenta allows us to see Carnival not as a sudden explosion of joy, but as the visible outcome of a deeper process. A process rooted in Afro-Brazilian ways of organizing community memory and presence. And it is from this foundation that we can begin to understand why Carnival carries such power and why it continues to provoke admiration, misunderstanding, and conflict. Because when culture carries ancestry, visibility becomes political, and rhythm becomes a form of statement. To understand the spiritual roots of Carnival, we must confront a word that has carried fear, distortion, and prejudice for generations. A word that appears whenever Afro-Brazilian spirituality is mentioned, often spoken with suspicion or hostility. That word is macumba. Today, macumba is frequently used as an insult, a shortcut for ignorance, a label applied to anything associated with Afro-Brazilian religions. without distinction or understanding. But this meaning is not original. Historically, macumba did not refer to evil curses or manipulation. It did not describe a religion in itself. In its earliest usage, the word was associated with rhythm, with percussion, with the sound of the drum. In many Afro-Brazilian contexts, macumba described the batuque, the foundational rhythmic expression through which communities communicated, organized rituals, and preserved ancestral memory. The drum was not an accessory, it was central. In African diasporic traditions, sound is not separate from meaning. Rhythm is a language. It carries emotion, instruction, hierarchy, and connection. In Candomblé and Umbanda, drums are not used to entertain. They are used to establish order, open paths, and mark transitions. When African traditions were violently disrupted by slavery and colonial repression, rhythm became one of the few elements that could not be fully erased. Drums traveled where people traveled. They adapted, transformed, and survived. And with them, the word macumba traveled as well. Over time, however, the meaning of the word was systematically altered. As Afro-Brazilian religious practices were criminalized and persecuted, their language was stripped of context. What once described sound and ritual became a symbol of fear. Authorities, religious institutions, and dominant cultural narratives reframed macumba as something dangerous, immoral, or threatening. This transformation did not happen naturally. It followed a familiar historical pattern. When a culture resists domination, it is often demonized. When a tradition cannot be controlled, it is labeled primitive or evil. By the early 20th century, macumba had become a tool of stigma, a way to discredit Afro-Brazilian spirituality without engaging with its meaning. Yet language does not remain fixed forever. In Carnival, something remarkable occurs. The rhythms once confined to the margins return to the center. The drum reclaims its voice. Milton Cunha argues that samba schools did not borrow from Afro-Brazilian spirituality. They emerged from his perspective, samba schools are cultural descendants of the batuque. The percussion sections that dominate the avenue are not merely musical ensembles. They are living continuations of sacred rhythm. When Cunha states that the samba school is macumba, he is not provoking controversy for shock. He is stating a historical truth. The samba school is built upon the same rhythmic intelligence that sustained Afro-Brazilian religious life. The difference is visible. In the avenue, this rhythm is no longer hidden. It is amplified. The stigma attached to macumba is confronted not through argument, but through presence, through sound, through beauty, through collective power. What was once mocked becomes undeniable. In this way, Carnival functions as a space of cultural reclamation. It does not erase the wounds of persecution, but it refuses silence. By placing Afro-Brazilian rhythm at the center of national identity, Carnival forces a confrontation with history. It asks an uncomfortable question. If this rhythm defines Brazilian culture, why has its spiritual origin been so violently rejected? This tension lies at the heart of Carnival's power. It is not only a celebration, it is a mirror. And in that mirror, Brazil is forced to see the depth of its African heritage, not as folklore, but as foundation. In recent decades, Brazil has experienced profound cultural and religious tension. While Afro-Brazilian traditions have shaped the country's identity, they have also become frequent targets of intolerance, misinformation, and violence. Temples have been invaded, sacred objects destroyed, communities silenced through fear. These acts are often justified through moral narratives that frame Afro-Brazilian religions as dangerous, illegitimate, or incompatible with modern society. This contradiction sits at the center of Brazil's cultural paradox. The same nation that celebrates Carnival as a symbol of national pride often struggles to accept the spiritual traditions that gave birth to it. In this context, Carnival becomes something more than a celebration. It becomes a public stage where suppressed histories reappear. The Sambadrome is not just a parade route. It is a platform, a space where communities from Brazil's peripheries step into the center of national and global attention. When samba schools choose to highlight Afro-Brazilian spirituality, they are not merely selecting aesthetic themes. They are asserting existence. They are saying, we are here. Our culture is alive. Our spirituality matters. This visibility is not neutral. To exalt African ancestry, indigenous memory, or Afro-Brazilian religions in a country marked by religious intolerance is an act that carries weight. It provokes discomfort. It forces dialogue. It exposes contradiction. Milton Cunha observes that samba schools have a unique ability to place difficult conversations at the center of Brazilian life. Through their narratives, they bring topics often pushed to the margins into living rooms, classrooms, and national broadcasts. Carnival is watched by millions inside Brazil and by audiences in more than 100 countries around the world. For a few hours, voices that are usually ignored become impossible to overlook. One of the most significant moments in this process occurred when a major samba school chose Exu as the central figure of its parade. Exu, long misrepresented and associated with fear, was placed at the heart of the avenue. Not as a caricature, not as provocation, but as cultural truth. For many viewers, this was shocking. For others, it was overdue. Exu's presence on the Samba-drome challenged centuries of distortion. It questioned why a figure associated with communication, movement, and balance had been transformed into a symbol of evil. And it revealed how deeply religious prejudice is embedded in cultural narratives. By placing Exu at the center of the parade, the Samba school did not seek conflict. It sought correction. This choice exposed a broader reality, that Afro-Brazilian spirituality has always been present in Carnival, even when unacknowledged. The difference now was visibility, and visibility in times of intolerance is powerful. For the communities that build the Samba schools, many of them black, poor, and historically marginalized, Carnival represents more than artistic expression. It is a moment of recognition, a moment when the nation and the world sees their creativity, discipline, intelligence, and beauty. Milton Cunha describes this moment as a form of collective affirmation. Communities that are often portrayed through narratives of violence or deficiency appear instead as creators of art, culture, and meaning. Carnival becomes a declaration: we are not defined by scarcity, we are defined by creativity. This does not erase social inequality, it does not solve religious intolerance, but it interrupts silence. It forces attention. It transforms the avenue into a space where suppressed histories are not whispered but sung. And in doing so, Carnival reveals itself as something deeply political, not in the sense of party ideology, but in the sense of presence. To exist visibly is in itself an act of resistance.